Fine. Make me your... I grew up reading fan fiction. I didn't really do any research for this video. I've known more than one person who's made it their life's work to do literary analysis of fan fiction as a cultural concept. They've spent hours and hours in libraries barely scratching the surface of everything there is to know. And, that's not what this is. I can't cover that. What I do want to do is say a few words about the All of Us Villains duology by Amanda Foody and Lynn Herman. Because I think that they taught me interesting things about my life as a fanfic reader and writer, and how fan fiction is, in a lot of ways, an art of necessity. Plus, I, really wanted to dress up for this. Aesthetically, these books are cool, and I am, at heart, just an edgy nerd. I'm just a theater kid. Okay, I got to wear all of my rings, so... If you're here because you haven't read All of Us Villains or All of Our Demise, and you just trust me, thank you. I don't know why you trust me, but I'm so glad you're here. If you don't normally watch my channel, but you were looking for reviews of All of Us Villains and or All of Our Demise, also welcome to my nightmare. I read this last month when it came out in paperback. I didn't know how I felt about it by the time I finished it. For those of you who don't know, the premise of All of Us Villains is that in a reality very similar to ours, except that there is magic present, everybody has access to common magic, which is white in its raw form, and can be collected in nature. And then put into vials and used to charge spell rings. There once was a form of magic called high magic, red in its raw power, that was so powerful that wars were fought over it. It dwindled over the years, and the last town that has access to it is Ilvernath, where the 7 most prominent families every 20 years each send a child champion to fight to the death for the right for that family to exclusively control high magic in town for the next generation. So, obviously, these books are about a tournament. They're about 7 teenagers who either choose to be or are chosen as champions for their families, and they go into this to fight to the death. It's kind of like if the Hunger Games were a competition between rich kids. I've actually seen some people say it's better than the Hunger Games, which has its merits, as we'll get into. I'm going to spoil this series in this review, by the way, so if you haven't read them and plan to, and spoilers matter to you, you would be best putting this video off until you have read them. But in terms of sci-fi fantasy, a speculative fiction concept, and in terms of world building, no, these books are of course not as good as the Hunger Games. But they do have an edge over it that I think probably wouldn't be possible without us all having gone through what we went through with the Hunger Games. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the different romantic relationships in this series. The ships, for those of you who somehow, everyone watching this knows what a ship is. I'm going to talk to you about the different ships and, oh, sorry, I got some blood on my teeth there. Um, and we're going to talk a little bit about a recent phenomenon I've been experiencing that I call the fanfiction paradox. So, I'm not going to get into all of the characters in All of Us Villains because I don't care about all of them. So while these books have multiple points of view, there are 4 point of view characters, one of whom I'm going to leave out of this discussion because she's not relevant to it. I feel that the true protagonist of this series is the point of view character for the first chapter in the whole series, and really the character around whom much of the action revolves, and that's Alistair Lowe. He is raised in the family that has won the majority of these tournaments in the past and is currently in possession of Ilvernouth's high magic. A family that takes pride in being perceived as villainous and has purposefully raised him to become a monster, which he is not great at because he's a little softy. I want to adopt him. The second major character I want to tell you about is Isabel McCasland. Her family is kind of gross and seedy. They don't win very often, but they want to win the tournament and they're willing to do anything to get that. Isabel herself is supposed to be pretty and popular, despite the fact that she spends most of these books in a velour tracksuit. I guess she's supposed to be fashionable, so... But, yeah. She is trying to come up as a sort of dark horse contender. And then there is Gavin Grieve, whose family has literally never won the tournament and whose parents essentially wrote him off as a loss at his birth, knowing he would be tournament champion, and so who has a lot to prove and very few resources. The first book spends a lot of time on an alliance of convenience between Alistair and Isabel, who fall into crush, I guess, with each other, and whose relationship is the conflict of a large part of this first book, eventually ending in a mutual betrayal where both of them essentially get the other stuck with a death curse. So it doesn't go super well. Meanwhile, we are treated to side scenes of Gavin obsessing over Alistair. At first, apparently because he knows he's his major competitor and wants to know his weaknesses, but it becomes increasingly clear that there's a bit of a crush, they're rivals. And Alistair briefly mentions some moments where he notices Gavin, but he's really wrapped up in Isabel, so we don't get a ton of that. So at the end of this book, Alistair and Isabel are broken up, and the tournament, it kind of hangs in the balance. The overarching plot of this is that some of the kids are trying to find a way to end the tournament once and for all, and it takes a very long time for them all to get on board with that due to various wrinkles in the plot. So, with Alistair and Isabel broken up and on opposite sides, and set up to maybe get a redemption of their love story, I put this down and was just furious because obviously Gavin is the better match for Alistair. It's it's startlingly clear. And I'm so used to this, you know? Like, I put down Harry Potter and I started writing fan fiction, and as I worked through all of my feelings about Harry and Ginny, I eventually realized that actually Ginny's perfect match was Luna and Harry's perfect match was Draco, and then I realized I was gay. And or with the Hunger Games, you put down the Hunger Games trilogy and you find yourself disappointed in Katniss's match with Peeta, and if you're me, you find yourself reading stories where Katniss gets with Joanna instead, who is a much more appropriate match for her. Their personalities are better for each other. So basically, in the YA fiction of my childhood, the gay relationships get sidelined no matter how much more appropriate they are. Um, we're all familiar with this and how it has become in television the phenomenon of queerbaiting. Um, so I put this book down. The sequel hadn't quite come out yet, it was still a couple weeks away. And I immediately searched the fanfiction archive for all of Us Villains fanfics. Because I figured, well, kids would do what kids would have done when I was growing up, which was immediately set out to fix the story, to put the characters together who they wanted together. And there were only two results in all of Archive of Our Own, which is the fan fiction site that I use the most frequently. And both of them were crossovers with other media, basically Hunger Games fusion, which makes sense. Very apparent concept in the mind of anyone reading this. But there was no Alistair Gavin fanfic, and I couldn't figure out why. Which I think is why I was surprised and delighted, but also somewhat blindsided when Oliver Demise told the story of Alistair and Gavin finding each other and falling in love. Which is what I wanted, for sure. It just, seeing it happen on the page, sorry, I needed that moment to repress my emotions. It was a surprise. You know, openly queer kids' books are more and more popular now. It's easy to stick to queer narratives in YA fiction a lot of the time, but with epic fantasies like this, still majority of the romances in them are heterosexual, and not only that, but like aggressively and painfully heterosexual, like leaning into gender roles heterosexual. I'm talking about Sarah J. Maas. Anyway, Alistair and Gavin actually end up together. And when I thought about that, and I thought about how little fan fiction there was written between the books, I realized that there was a solid possibility that the reason that kids weren't writing fan fiction before the sequel came out was because they were waiting to see if the sequel put Alistair and Gavin together. Uh, because they thought it could happen. And it did. We wouldn't have waited to be disappointed. We would have taken the initiative. But the kids reading these books didn't need to. And that for me is the fan fiction paradox. That fan fiction has grown out of a sense of marginalization, a sense of dissatisfaction with stories as they stand, even stories we deeply love, even stories that are important to us. You know, Anakin and Obi-Wan finally kiss, or fuck you, J.K. Rowling, Harry Potter is trans. That sort of thing. Uh, Even in the very early days of fan fiction, something as simple as, stop it with the will they won't they, Mulder and Scully are totally in love. It's straight, but still valid. And, I don't think this is the end of fan fiction or anything, but it is an interesting crossroads to me because it isn't always the fiction of disappointment anymore, or the fiction of unfulfilled potential. We get shows like Good Omens or Our Flag Means Death where the queerness is overt and people still write fan fiction. They write modern AUs and flower shop AUs and historical AUs and just revel in the comfort of these characters finding each other over and over and over again in different iterations. That's not going to go away. But mid-series fix-it fanfics, well, maybe we won't get as many of those anymore. And that's good, actually. So what do I actually think of these books, since, this is ostensibly a book review or whatever? I think they're pretty solid. I had fun. I was turning pages the whole time. I thought All of Us Villains was mediocre, and All of Our Demise was a pretty strong finish to the story arc. Really, I would recommend, if you're going to read them, do it back to back, as if they were one volume. Listen, if the premise, as I described it, appeals to you, read it. If you wouldn't read it for the premise, don't read it. I thought they were nice, and I'm glad that they exist because they mean normalization. And that means everything.